glitch, but we seem to have resolved it. So welcome to the Senate Education Committee, and I understand that we have invited the Assembly Committee to join us, and as always, members will be in and out, but we are being televised, and I'm sure that they'll catch snippets of whatever's going on here. And I really want to thank my committee members and in total and my consultant on this project. I know that your binder was at a barbell to exercise, and it's meant to be a resource to answer questions about LCFF. Well, with that, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Senate Education Committee. Today's hearing is intended to update us on the extensive work being done to develop a new accountability framework for K-12 education. LCFF, LCAP, evaluation rubrics, and the reauthorization of the federal Every Student Succeeds Act all contribute to a complex landscape of opportunity and possibilities. We anticipate that a new accountability system will be operational beginning in 2017-18 school year, and it's my hope that today's hearing will provide us a better understanding of accountability, where we have been, where we are going, and how we can use and build upon existing tools and what policy levers may exist for the legislature to inform and influence the process. Our agenda is the LAO, who will provide us with an overview of the current accountability system and the new federal law, as well as issues for legislative consideration. The State Board of Education and the Department of Education will then bring us up to date on their activities and thoughts regarding the development of evaluation rubrics and technical assistance and intervention under the new accountability framework. Finally, we'll hear from districts involved in testing the rubrics, as well as issues of concern to our advocacy community as accountability unfolds. In the packet, members, the background materials, you'll find information from the State Board agenda items such as guiding principles, draft framework, implementation plans, and you have an updated draft timeline. You also have an overview of the reauthorized federal Every Student Succeeds Act. You have a draft of the evaluation rubrics. You have information related to the testing of the rubrics. You have data from the core district's accountability systems. You have information presented to the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. You have information about accountability for alternative schools, a letter from advocates to the State Board regarding design requirements and principles guiding the development of the rubrics, including the Black Mind Matters report, and information on parent engagement. So with that, I look forward from our panelists, or hearing from our panelists, and learning more about the development of the new accountability system. And I welcome the LAO, who will provide us with an overview of the current systems related tools, federal law, and updates on the development of the new system. Welcome, Edgar Cabral.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members. Edgar Cabral with the Legislative Analyst Office. My goal here is just to provide you with a very high-level background on our state and federal accountability systems, to provide some context for kind of where the position the state is in right now, and some of the major activities that are occurring right now and major decisions moving forward. There's the handout being passed out that provides some of the detail. I won't go into all of the details in the handout, but it just serves as background for you in terms of getting a big picture sense of what's been happening. So right now there are changes happening both in the state accountability system and the federal accountability systems that really create an opportunity to create one unified system that can serve as a system for providing support for schools across the state, And we think this is a great opportunity to look into those issues. And a lot of these issues, in order to kind of combine these systems, there may be changes in legislation that may be coming before you that will need to make some major changes to our system as it currently exists. Starting with the state system, so the state has had it really kind of in terms of its accountability system, the API has been the basis of that. That's the Academic Performance Index. It is essentially it takes all of the performance on standardized tests and summarizes it into one number. And what the state has done is with that number, ranges between 200 to 1,000, can also rank schools, and what's been commonly used is a decile ranking. So if you're a number 10, you're in the top 10% of schools. If you're a number 1, you're in the bottom 10% of schools. And this information has been used in a couple ways. One is just a transparency tool, provide information to the public so that parents and others in the public can get a sense of how schools are doing. The other piece has been to provide additional support for low-performing schools, or in a few brief years, we also provided some awards for high-performing schools. But in terms of state dedication of resources, the bigger piece was providing support for low-performing schools, and there were 3 different programs that the state has developed over the last 15 years, and none of them are active anymore, but they were all an attempt to say, okay, we have this accountability system, we're going to use this API to both provide the public with resources or with information about how schools are doing, but then also provide some additional resources to those schools who might need help to improve. Now, this is kind of how the system worked for about 15 years or so. We also had, it's important to point out, we had something that is known as SARC, School Accountability Report Card, and that's something that's been around since the late 80s, and this is a document that school districts have to post on their website, and that the department has in a database online that provides not just information on test scores, but lots of information on a school's programs. For example, do they have college prep coursework? What kind of career pathways courses do they have? Information on pupil staffing ratios, spending per student, that kind of information. And it's really a tool for parents in that case. The state doesn't do anything with that information to say, let's see who needs additional support. It's simply a tool for providing the public with additional information. In 2013, there were 2 major changes that have really caused the state to shift and change the framework. The first piece was what's AB 484, which is a bill that enacted our new testing system. And in that new testing system, we had to incorporate the math and English language arts exams based on the Common Core state standards. And in order to incorporate that into the API, there were technical changes that were necessary. So the state in the legislature, in adopting that legislation, provided the superintendent and the State Board of Education with the authority to suspend the API for 2014 and 2015 in order to work out those details. And they did ultimately suspend in both of those years, essentially. And then the other important thing that happened in 2013 is the adoption of LCFF, and the statute that created the LCFF didn't just change the school funding formula, but also essentially set forth a new framework for accountability at the state level. And this framework is based on these 8 state priority areas that have been identified in the law. The priority areas, they're looking at, one of the priority areas is student achievement, but there's a lot more beyond that, for example, information on school climate, student engagement, parental involvement, course access, a greater number of variables than just looking at performance on standardized tests. And then those 8 state priority areas show up really in 2 places. First is in school districts' local control and accountability plans. And these are plans that school districts are required to adopt annually, and they are supposed to set goals in the 8 state priority areas, and then specify the actions they're going to take to make progress in meeting those goals. And the law in these priority areas includes very specific metrics that school districts should be using. They can use other metrics besides those, but it provides some framework for the type of information that we expect school districts to keep track of through their LCAPs. The next piece that complements that was what's called the evaluation rubrics, and this is something that's still in progress that the State Board of Education is working on now. Under current law, the board is required to adopt evaluation rubrics by October of 2016. And these rubrics, the goal is that these rubrics could be served for two purposes. One is that a district can use this tool as a way to do a self-evaluation of how the school district is doing, to figure out where are the key areas where the district might need to take action to improve outcomes for students. And then the second piece is for county offices to use to identify school districts that might need additional support and assistance. And the statute sets forth essentially two levels of support and assistance. One that's a kind of more narrow focus if there's a school district that's been not improving outcomes for a particular student subgroup or in a particular priority area, there can be some assistance provided. And there's the second level that's more for kind of persistently low achieving school districts that provides the superintendent with authority to, for example, go in and change an LCAP or take some more major action to help get the school district in the right direction. So these are the kind of the big changes that are part of LCFF, and so the board in suspending the API also sent the signal that they wanted not just to suspend the API for 2015, but that there should be a shift in our accountability system to no longer focus just on the API, just on standardized tests, but to use this new framework as the basis of a new accountability system that looked at multiple measures, that looked at things like student achievement, but also other things like student engagement. Do we have problems of attendance, chronic absenteeism? Are there suspension, expulsion issues at schools and school districts? So that in and of itself is lots of work at the state level. And then on top of that, there are now just been recent changes at the federal level. In December 2015, the president signed the Every Student Succeeds Act, which essentially gets rid of the old No Child Left Behind system and replaces it with a new accountability framework. The old No Child Left Behind system was a very specific and prescriptive approach, so that it set AYP, or adequate yearly progress targets, and these targets steeply increased over time, and schools and districts that didn't meet those targets were then required to enter program improvement. If they did not improve or hit those targets over the next couple of years, there were corrective action that needed to be taken, and the law specified some very specific options for how corrective action was applied. So the federal government had prescribed this very specific framework for how this worked. The new federal system, it really provides a lot more flexibility, and it says, states, you develop your plans, we need to approve them, but we're gonna provide you with a lot more flexibility. Now, there are a few key components that the legislation requires, and a lot of this really actually complements what the state is doing with the evaluation rubrics. There is at a minimum a requirement that states measure academic achievement, graduation rates for high schools, academic growth in student achievement for elementary and middle schools. Also, the improvement in the proficiency of English learners. And then finally, there's another measure that states have the option to decide what measure that will be, and it does it. There's a lot of flexibility there, but the idea is that this is something that's not just measuring performance on a test. So by shifting away from the AYP, which was primarily, again, a test-based accountability system, to now providing kind of a little bit more flexibility, there is a lot of what the federal government is asking for that the state is already doing. Essentially, everything that they are requiring that states measure, the state is already measuring through the evaluation rubrics. The other piece that's very similar is kind of support for schools who are struggling. So the federal legislation requires kind of two levels of support. One, a more targeted support for schools where there's where one specific subgroup is not performing well, and then something that's called comprehensive support, which is a much sort of more intensive support for a school that is not doing well in a variety of areas. So again, this is very similar to the framework that we have for the state system, where we have under the evaluation rubrics essentially two levels of support. So again, this is a place where what the state and the federal government, the state and federal systems are very similar, and we think can be blended very easily. There are a couple places where we think that there will be some additional work necessary to kind of blend these two systems, or the requirements of these two pieces of legislation. I think the intent is that it would be one system. The first is what are called the level of review. Whose outcomes are you looking at? The federal government, all of the language is about schools and looking at how schools are doing. Most of the state system is really based on district level review. The districts adopt LCAPs. The evaluation rubrics are based on district level information. And so there'll need to be some work done to kind of make sure that those things can work well together. For most of the information that are part of the state priority areas and that are part of the evaluation rubrics, there is school level data for that. So it's not something that is an insurmountable issue. It's just something that is not in the current discussions about what's in the evaluation rubric and the drafts of things that we've seen. There hasn't been kind of an emphasis on the school level. The other piece is the federal government in requiring comprehensive support, this sort of second, more intensive level of support for schools, requires states to provide comprehensive support to all of the 5% lowest performing schools in the state. Now, in order to do that, you need to have some kind of mechanism for figuring out who those bottom 5% schools are. And right now in our system, and what we're moving to the evaluation rubrics, there is no kind of summary measure without the API. We have 8 priority areas. We have data, a lot of data in various metrics. And in the draft evaluation rubrics, there is specific in the draft, there appears that you could look at your, say, graduation rate and see how that compares across the state. Are you above or below average? But there is no summary mechanism to sort of say, okay, as a whole, how are you doing? And now, again, this is not something that's insurmountable. One thing that the state could do is pick a few of these key areas or key indicators and use that as a basis for determining the lowest 5%. But it is something that's not currently in our system. So those are, I think, are two things that we see as important issues moving forward. But again, we do think that this is an opportunity to have one unified system. In the past, we had many schools and school districts who, according to the API, were performing fine. They were doing good, and under No Child Left Behind, they were failing. And it created a lot of mixed messages. It was confusion for school districts, and we think that the opportunity to have one system, to clean that up, to have one system of support really could lead to a significant improvement in our accountability system at the state. So I will stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Very much. Are there any questions for Mr. Cabral? Thanks for the background. Our next panel is development of a new state accountability system. We have Michael Kirst, who is president of the State Board of Education, Sue Burr, who's member of the State Board, Carrick Ashley, who's a deputy superintendent of the CDE, this panel, hopefully, will describe their thinking, work that has been completed and work that remains to be done. And this panel does include staff from the Department of Education. So he'll explain the work of the Advisory Task Force on Accountability and Continuous Improvement. Welcome, Mr. Kirst. A chart you are distributing. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us, and we look forward to a fruitful discussion. We'll be talking a lot about some detailed concepts here, and for the audience, I want to say the State Board of Education posted yesterday quite a long description of what we're going to cover today, so people that hear it verbally and want to follow up and read it, it's on the SBE website. So 2016 will be a very big year for accountability in California. The board will approve the rubrics for the local control funding formula in September. And then we have to prepare a overall state plan for the whole elementary and secondary act, ESSA, and every Student Succeeds Act, it's called. And so the state plan, the board will be voting on, hopefully, in its November meeting. So this year should be the year that we put all this together in that regard. As Elio indicated, we're going to have an integrated and federal-state program of some of the issues that he mentioned. We have already sent the board and the department to the federal government comments, allowing us to have flexibility. They can close off some of these options, or they can just leave the law. As we read the law, it'll fit even easier with what we're going to present today. So we have a federal-state integrated system, and then we will have, an unprecedented in America kind of system of these local metrics that come out of the local control funding formula. And so we'll have a concise set of indicators, federal, state, which the governor referred to in his budget message, and then a very deep set of rubric and metrics indicators at the local level. So it'll be quite interesting and quite novel. So this indicates that we're in the forefront of shifting from an education system based on compliance to one based on support and continuous improvement. So the area of just shame and blame and all of that is ended with the end of NCLB. And of course, our premise with you has been that those closest to the students are best equipped to make decisions about programs and services to support them. But we do need to have some kind of accountability system, which we'll discuss today. We've had many groups working in collaboration on this, and we're really positive about the fact that lawmakers, school officials, equity groups, unions, management, parents, businesses, higher education have all been working collaboratively, and we seem to be emerging in an infield of the same set of concepts, and I think that augurs well for the future. This is the third year of the local control funding formula, and we have had also hundreds of meetings about that. And, the mantra of the board and of me and the governor, I think, is patience, persistence, humility. We're going to be patient. We're going to persist. It'll be 8 years. And we are going to proceed with humility in that when you do things like the local control funding formula and LCAP, you really don't know what's going to happen. They're unprecedented, and there's no clear roadmap. So we're making changes as we go along. We do know that the new funding formula and the LCAP, Local Accountability Plan, has changed the school budget process. This has been aided by the repeal of 40 state categorical programs in the LCFF. And there's evidence of the following things. We have more parent and community engagement through the Local Control Accountability Plan. We have been able to bring together the fiscal and curriculum leaders of local school districts. In the past, the budget was done largely by a budget office, and the curriculum instruction people were not as deeply involved as they have been under the LCAP system. We have improved 3-year planning processes so that districts can look 3 years ahead, and we have also been able to focus them on the state's educational priorities. I have been in education policy for 52 years now, and I don't know of any similar thing to what we have done, which is to try and use the school budget and the school budget process in a more fine-grained way to improve education and to improve instruction and offer community engagement in services. So that's part of the humility part. There's no precedence that I can go back and read about and say, oh, well, this is the way you do it. So with that, we have found several challenges that have been identified in the Local Control Accountability Plan process. Some of the common themes that have emerged are the LCAPs are too long and complex, making them difficult to read and understand, and tending to push the process more back to compliance and less on effective resource allocation. Secondly, there's a great deal of inconsistency around how much of the local education agency's overall budget is reflected in the LCAP. That, I think, is something also that we're going to be working on. There is a general lack of connection between the information in the LCAP and the local education agency's underlying budget. So the LCAP hears something, how does it relate to the budget? If you're going to do better resource allocation and more effective allocation of money, those two have to be working in sync more. And finally, Section 3 of the LCAP rarely provides clear and specific information of how services are being increased or improved for low-income students. So those are some of the areas that we have heard about, and you've heard about, I know. So the State Board of Education will be considering proposed revisions in its May meeting to simplify the LCAP template, not for this school year, but for the 2017-18 school year, with the expected final adoption in September. So we're going to look at the LCAP as well as the accountability issues that we're mostly going to talk about today. Of course, we'll continue with extensive stakeholder engagement. And I know you've been patient, and so changes in this magnitude will take time. And we look forward to continuing dialogue with you and the legislature as a whole as we try and work on this and figure it out together. It's getting better, it's better, it can be even better. So with that as an opening, I'm going to turn over the more detailed discussion of accountability to Board Member Sue Burr, who is a State Board of Education liaison for the local control accountability area, the rubrics and accountability. We specialize with board members taking different domains, and this is Sue's domain, so I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to refer to this table. We tried to take your barbell binder and turn it into one page, so you can tell us whether or not we succeeded. First, I'd just like to reinforce a few things that Edgar said and that Dr. Kirsch said, that the implementation of this massive change has really occurred in 3 phases, 2 of which have really been completed. And if you start on the left side of this table and work over to the right, I'll talk a little bit about that. But I always like to remind folks that the first phase was a complete overhaul of the school finance system that has been backed up now over the 3-year period by an infusion of $13 billion to our K-12 education system. So I always want to make sure we celebrate that, because we went through such tough times for a while before we got to this place where we were able to recognize the needs of our schools and provide significant new funding through the legislature. The other part of it that has been completed, and Mike touched on this, is the development of the local control accountability template, and also spending regulations that the State Board of Education adopted to ensure that the students who are actually generating the funding were recipients of the services that they needed to have. That was done in 2013. We subsequently updated the template, and as Mike said, we'll keep working on it because we need to make some improvements. The other thing we haven't mentioned yet is that the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, which was established as the main support and assistance entity in the statute, has been convened. I know we're going to talk about that later more specifically, but those things are already in place. Just wanted to make sure that we knew about that. And I think the important point I want to make about that is that while improvements can be made to LCAP, and they certainly will be, it's important to underscore that local accountability has been in place for nearly 3 years. And as we think about it, that's really the bedrock of the local control funding formula and local control accountability. So it's not as if the state sort of, walked away and said, well, there's nothing in place. The local folks have their plans in place. As Dr. Kirsch mentioned, that it is firmly taking hold, particularly around local engagement, parent engagement, community engagement, and strategic planning. We hear stories frequently of school districts who have said, this is great for our strategic plan, helps us identify our goals, know where we're going, and then we also have annual updates to say, did we in fact meet those goals or not? All, again, very transparent and done in a local way. The third phase, which is what we're now entering into, and that's kind of the middle part of this, are the developments of the evaluation rubrics. And I'm sure you'll recall that the statute calls on the board to develop a holistic, multidimensional system of accountability, which is why you hear so much about moving away from the API, which was not multidimensional, it was test score based. The rubrics are intended, the purpose is to assist the local education agencies, so school districts and charter schools and county offices, to identify their strengths, their weaknesses, and their areas where they need to improve. This, again, is kind of the bedrock of the system. It's built on continuous improvement. How are you doing? How are you going to get better? As opposed to what was the old status system of, do you meet a bar, yes or no? Right now, the evaluation rubrics will be undergirded by standards. We're required to set standards for improvement and outcome in each one of the 8 state priority areas. So that's what we're working on now. In order to conduct that work, we've again engaged in broad-based stakeholder engagement over the last several months, but it's also been undergirded by research. We have a contract with WestEd. We've asked WestEd to bring us all the research they possibly can on indicators that we know are predictive of student success. So we're working on that. And of course, we believe from a policy standpoint that we have to ensure that they're valid, that they're reliable, and they're comparable across LEAs, because we don't want to get in a situation where we're measuring things that are not appropriate. We now have, as Edgar mentioned, this amazingly fortuitous opportunity to merge this work that we're doing with standards under evaluation rubrics with what the federal government now says they want on accountability. So if you look at the far right-hand box, we identify the 5 indicators that the federal government under Every Student Succeed Act has said we have to address. And as Edgar underscored, the great thing about it is we're already measuring all of those. So the first one is student achievement as measured in English and mathematics. And remember, these are only grades 3 through 8 and 11, because that's what we're testing now in Smarter Balanced. The graduation rate, the progress of English learners toward proficiency. We will have to pick another academic measure of some kind for K-8. And I will just reinforce what Dr. Kirsch said. The state board staff is in the process of posting a series of memos that will be on our website, one of which will be key indicators to consider. So we'll be thinking about what would we want to plug into that particular place. And then at least one other, and it could be a non-academic measure, so some measure of school climate or something along those lines, or we could also consider the conditions of learning, which is one of our state priorities over on the left, which have been in place for a long time. People know about them as the Williams requirements, instructional materials, teacher quality, and safe facilities. So in sort of the way I look at this is we have a very broad base of 8 state priorities, lots of metrics that are both state and local. As we come now to have a single integrated federal state system, is it possible to have a way to unify those priorities and simplify those priorities that to make them congruent with the federal requirements for purposes of measuring at the state level? And then what do we do with those measurements is down at the bottom box, and Edgar mentioned this, is it essentially helps us to identify LEAs, which we assume the overwhelming majority of LEAs will be doing fine, and they'll go back into this annual process at the local level, but there will be some number that will need additional support and assistance. And it can be this light touch, which is technical assistance, the counties, the CCEE provides assistance. It might have to be much more in-depth, and to the point where the superintendent of public instruction would need to be providing some additional intervention. So that's what those bottom 2 charts are for. So I hope that helps kind of pull it all together in one piece. Happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, I think we'll turn it over to our partner, Carrick Ashley, to talk about all the work the department's doing.